Well, thank you everyone for joining us live on Zoom and in the future and currently on live stream in our Psychedelically Speaking series. We have David Casimir with us today. As you may have seen from his bio, he has been a patent attorney for an intellectual property attorney. Sorry, I can't get it wrong right out of the gate, for over 25 years with his own firm. He also is a graduate of he has a BS in cellular and molecular biology from the University of Michigan, an MS and a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Wisconsin, and a Juris Doctorate from Stanford University. He also co-created Porta Sophia, which is both a repository for prior arts to oppose frivolous patents, and they also do advocacy. And there's amazing work there. And I would just like to share from my personal intuitive observation of David. He is someone who moves very quickly and jubilantly through adversity. I think when he sees a challenge, he just takes it on and maintains a really positive attitude. And I find that to be rare. So I'm really grateful that he could join us today and talk about the legal landscape of psychedelics and his work, anything else he would like to share. And he's very open to questions. If you would like to raise your hand, pop them in a chat, or if you're so bold to just blurt them out entirely, he's very open and receptive. So thank you so much for being with us today, David, and I turn it over to you.
All right, thanks for having me. And I'm going to share my screen here. I have some slides. And do let me know if there's any technical glitches, and if maybe someone could just confirm the slide is showing there.
It is.
Excellent, thank you so much. So we're going to talk about patents to start off with and sort of the legal aspects of it. And then I'm going to get into more of a discussion of what we're doing at Porta Sophia related to patents and psychedelics, because there's a lot of very interesting things going on these days. But what Porta Sophia is it's a nonprofit organization that was designed to represent the public interest and focus on dealing with issues around information, education, and communication deficiencies at the interface of psychedelic medicine and patents. And we formed it because there are quite a few deficiencies that needed addressing. And so what I want to start off with here is a discussion about why do we care about patents and what are patents? It's a topic that really no one learns about in their lives unless they get somehow embroiled in the world of patents, which is very, very few people. Yet patents have a huge influence on kind of commerce in general around the world, but particularly in the healthcare fields and as it relates to clinical medicine and drugs and therapeutics. And so it is certainly currently having an impact, and I think we'll have an even bigger impact in the future in the development of psychedelic therapies and their ability to get out there into the world. And as noted, if you do have questions, just blurt them out, and I'm happy to answer them on the fly here. And from a tech standpoint, I'm seeing my slides right now, so I'm not seeing if anyone's typing in chat. So if someone does have some chat, if someone doesn't mind just blurting out the question, and I can handle it live.
We will let you know.
Excellent, thank you much. So let's talk about patents. And patents are one form of the concept called intellectual property. Intellectual property is a general term that covers a number of different categories of topics like copyrights and trademarks and patents, and then there's a few more obscure ones. But in general, what intellectual property has in common is it's basically the government or the governments around the world granting property rights in people's ideas. So for example, like copyright can protect things like music and art. So if someone creates an idea like a song, copyright protection gives them the ability to own aspects of the music they created, so that if someone copies that music or the lyrics or the song without their permission, they have some ability to rein that in. And patents are one of these regimes that's targeted at inventions and innovations, essentially the the creation of things, could be new products or processes. And patents cover a broad swath of things out there in the universe. Relevant to psychedelics, they cover things like new psychedelic compounds, so the chemistry itself. But what surprises a lot of people is you can get patents on using known compounds and even natural compounds if applied in a new way. So even though many psychedelic chemicals have been around as long as nature's been around and have been used by humans for, in some cases, thousands of years, if someone finds a new use for one of these natural compounds, they are potentially able to get a patent on that. So for example, using psilocybin to treat certain mental health conditions. And so what's important about patents is they're actually quite powerful government rights that are granted. The general rule in most countries around the world apply these general rules is if someone can get a patent, they end up gaining a monopoly that lasts essentially 20 years that allows them to control 4 activities. And essentially, it allows them to stop anyone out there in the world from doing any one of or more of these 4 activities, which is making the invention, selling the invention, using the invention, or importing the invention. And between those 4 activities, that covers almost anything someone would do with a drug. So let's say, for example, someone got a patent on a psychedelic compound. By having that patent, they can stop anyone from making that compound. They can stop anyone from selling it. And then probably most powerfully, they can stop anyone from using it. And what does it mean to stop them? What that means is if someone violates the patent, and the legal term is infringes the patent by doing any one of those 4 things, in the United States, that party could be sued in federal court by the patent owner. And then the patent owner could ask for several things. They could ask for money from the party who violated the patent. They can ask the court to demand that the party who violated the patent stop. That's called an injunction. They might also ask that any remaining versions of the drug or whatever the patented thing is get destroyed. And then there's huge costs involved in these patent conflicts. It's very typical for a case that goes from the initiation of a lawsuit to a trial to cost each side multiple millions of dollars. Average costs in the United States range between maybe $3 and $10 million for a highly contested case. And the most contentious cases can be multiples of that. So they're extraordinarily expensive as well. And so if you think about this power, if someone has a patent on one of these drugs or the use of one of these drugs, they're able to stop anyone in the commerce chain. They can stop the manufacturer of the drug. They can stop the seller of the drug, and those 2 are oftentimes different parties. And they can stop the users of the drug, which means they potentially can shut down clinics or other, in theory, they can actually sue patients or sue individuals. Let's say someone's using one of these drugs at home. In theory, they're liable under a lawsuit and could be sued even as an individual. So they're very powerful government rights. So how important are patents in the area of pharmaceuticals? And I'm going to treat that category very broadly to include use of natural compounds, sort of anything that's sort of a regulated health process, so everything associated with drugs. So a few very important points that sort of drive the importance of patents in the pharmaceutical space. First, it's extraordinarily expensive to develop drugs and get them approved through the regulatory process. The average cost from the initial idea of a new drug or a new use for a drug to getting it approved by the FDA generally runs in the hundreds of millions up to several $billion range. People always wonder, how can it cost that much? But if anyone's been involved in one of these development processes and the regulatory process in particular, you can see how these costs just build up over time. These are multi-year processes. And for most drugs in the United States now, I believe they typically are over $1 billion to make it through that process. And so, that's not money most people have lying around. And that means that money needs to come from someone. And it typically comes from investors, which could just be private investors, venture investors and such, or large pharmaceutical companies oftentimes are the ones who invest these dollars, either by investing in a smaller company that's developing one of these drugs, or just buying that smaller company or buying the technology and developing it themselves and using their own money. Now, anyone who's investing money into one of these projects is generally not in the business of losing that money. So they want to generally see a profit. And so they're only going to invest in these technologies and these businesses and these ideas. And they're only going to put in those hundreds of millions or billions of dollars if they think they can make the money back. And without a patent or some other regime that gives the developer of that drug or the inventor of that drug some period of exclusivity, generally what's going to happen is that money is not going to be available, and there just won't be the funds available to develop the drug, and it will never get out into the market and be usable in the clinic. And the reason for that, when you think about it, makes a lot of sense. So let's say someone did spend $2 billion developing a drug, and there was no ability for them to get exclusivity around that. What you'd very quickly see after they launched the drug and after the government said, yes, this is a drug that can legally be sold, is someone would immediately launch what would be called a generic drug, a copycat, selling the same drug. It would not generally take much work for them to figure out what that drug is, and maybe even just based on public information, it would be clear what it is, and they would be able to sell that drug and compete with the company that just spent $2 billion developing it, without themselves having to spend much money at all to get it to that point. And so they would be able to sell it at a lower cost. And then there would be a third generic and a fourth generic and a fifth generic. And it would sort of be a race to who could sell that drug for the least amount of money. And while that may be very, very good from a public perspective, in that the drugs might be widely available at whatever the minimal cost would be, the original sort of inventor or developer of that drug who took the risk and spent the money to get through the regulatory process, enabling everyone else to join the field, would never recoup their billions of dollars. And knowing that, the investors just aren't going to put that money into those companies, knowing that it would be lost without some type of exclusivity. And so patents generally are critical assets to allow companies to raise the funds needed to get through the development and regulatory processes. And so they're powerful government granted instruments for those who own them, and they're incredibly important in the therapeutic space. And that creates a lot of good and bad incentives. Let me stop there and see. I've been chatting without giving much of a gap here. Any questions before we sort of dive into more specifics about how this plays out in the psychedelic space?
This
All right.
is
Yeah, please.
This is just tangentially related, but I'm just curious. So after a period of exclusivity ends, okay, and the generics also enter the market, I'm just wondering with like Benadryl, for example. I mean, if you go to the drugstore, you've got the Benadryl, then you've got the generic, and you're saving about $4 or $5 to get the generic drug. Is the producer of Benadryl just relying on their name at that point for the extra premium on the price?
Yeah, usually that's the case. If there are true generics out there where someone's able to make the exact same product, that's exactly right. And there's a long history of that. By having sort of good branding and generating a reputation with that original branding, people can generally keep a little bit of a premium on their product. What you'll see is, and it varies widely drug to drug or medical device to medical device, but generally the cost of a patented drug to a generic tends to be, the patented drug tends to be 60 to 80% higher on average before the patent sort of goes off term. And then the generic comes in at that relatively large discount. But, that there can be extremes. It could be 100-fold less expensive in some cases. And other cases, it might not be much less expensive at all. But what you'll see is the generic typically will come in at, an 60 to 80% cost reduction compared to the patented drug. And then the patent owner will typically have to also reduce their price at that point, but they will not drop it all the way down to the generic. They'll keep a little bit of the premium based on that reputation and trademark.
Thank you. Yeah.
And then I will note, there are sort of gimmicks a lot of pharmaceutical companies play. One of the common ones is, some number of years before the patent goes off term and they know generics are going to be coming on the market, they'll come up with, I'm going to put air quotes around the word improved here, an improved version of whatever their drug is. It might be a small chemical change to the drug or a small formulation change, maybe a dosing change, something like that, and launch that new version right around the time the first one is becoming generic, and then have a large marketing campaign around the new one, arguing its sort of improved properties. And it may, in fact, have improved properties. The degree to which it's better might get lost in the marketing budget of that company. And so that second drug might then separately be patentable for another 20 years. And to the extent the drug company can convince people that that's sort of the better version, they might be able to hold on to an even bigger share of the market with their new drug at the full sort of patent premium price. And there are many, many, many examples of that process being successful. All right, so let's talk about kind of specifically the problem we saw in the psychedelic space. And this shocked me when I first saw it, and this is the reason why we formed Porta Sophia, which is we were seeing a lot of really broad patents being granted by the US Patent Office that made no sense. These were patents granted on concepts or ideas that we knew had been around for many, many years. And one of the critical things to get a patent is you have to have invented something new. You can't patent something that already existed. And that's logical, right? If people already have the idea out there and have been using the thing, potentially even commercially, someone can't come along later, get a patent on that, say they own that for 20 years, and then stop people from doing what they were already doing. The patent system is set up so that if anyone was doing the thing before, you can't get the patent on it. Essentially, things that are already invented by someone else or in the public domain stay out there in the world. And what we were seeing is 68% of when we check these early years of patents being granted, 68% of the what we considered overly broad patent applications that were being filed, sort of the unfair ones, the ones that dipped their toe into the public domain and were essentially taking rights away from the public, were being granted. And sometimes the patent office makes mistakes, and this is true in all fields. There's a certain percentage of patents that will get granted that should not have been granted, but that number is generally very, very small in most technical fields, and it was astronomically high in the field of psychedelics. And so we asked ourselves, well, why? What's going on here? And the answer ended up being fairly straightforward, which was, when the patent office reviews patent applications to determine whether something is new or not, they typically look at two major sources of information. One of those is earlier patents, and the second one is the literature, typically sort of the scientific literature, the peer-reviewed literature, which for most fields between those two categories is a pretty good coverage of what came before. But because psychedelics lived underground for so many years, you just generally don't see most of the public knowledge about psychedelics in earlier patents because people just weren't filing them. There was no purpose to filing them because you couldn't commercially use the ideas because these things were illegal, or at least in flux, and their legality was questionable. And that's only changed or changing recently. And then it's not the peer-reviewed literature because no one was doing the research. It was underground, but underground is maybe not quite the right term. Underground is a sort of a social term, but it was still quite public. The information was out there to find. It just wasn't in peer-reviewed literature or in patents. And so the patent offices weren't finding these things. They were believing that these ideas were new, and they were granting all of these patents. And this next slide also maybe shows sort of the alarming trend here. The idea that psychedelics might become commercial products is a fairly new idea. I guess the idea has been out there for quite a while, but it's a new realization, and investment dollars are flowing in. And along with those investment dollars, come the inventors who believe that they have a new idea and want to get a patent on it to get the power that patents give. And what I'm showing here, this is data that Porta Sophia has collected. We systematically review every patent and patent application in the field of psychedelics. We have a team of researchers. When these applications become published, we search for them, we identify them, and we characterize them. And we characterize a subset of them as high threat if they are attempting to seek a monopoly that unduly covers information that's in the public domain and that presents a threat to the public domain. And so there are many more patent applications than I'm showing here, but what I'm showing here is our numbers on what we would consider high threat applications, the ones that, if granted, would create a problem for the world, keeping in mind that we had this 68% grant rate. So without someone intervening in this process, maybe more than half of these would grant. And you can see this huge tick up where there was something on the order of less than 10 of these filed per year for the longest time. And now we're moving into a rate where there are several hundred, almost certainly in 2023, and more than 100 in 2021 and 2022, with this trend line continuing. So we had a problem on the patent office granting these at alarming rates when they shouldn't have been. And we have a problem that the number of applications being filed is going up in substantial numbers. So let me stop there and see if there's any questions around those topics.
Hey, David, I have a question.
Sure.
These companies who are poised to get, or these individuals, I guess I should say, to get these psychedelic patents, do you think they view psychedelics kind of the same as any other pharmaceutical, or are they seeing this as like something new, industry shifting? Because I look at this graph and it seems to me that the latter is the case, but I'm really curious to hear your opinion on it.
Yeah, I think it is seen as new and industry shifting, and I can say that for a number of reasons. One is when you look at the identity, who sort of the entities who are active in this space, it's not the traditional players. It's not big pharma. I mean, there's been a little interest by big pharma, but from what I've seen, big pharma is sort of sitting back and watching and waiting for this market to develop and waiting to see how the FDA responds. Most of this activity is in the hands of small to mid-sized companies and even individual people. So some of the patents we've seen that make up this list here are what I would call intellectual property entrepreneurs, just individuals who are seeking to own some of the space so that if a company does go into the space, they might be able to come in with their patent and get some value out of that. But a lot of it is small companies, and a lot of these are not companies that existed previously. They're companies that were created specifically to explore the psychedelic space. So there's a lot of differences in this field in general compared to other areas of pharmaceuticals.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right, so let's talk about some of the potential bad impacts of, or potential impacts of these bad patents. And some of them might be logical from the earlier discussion here, but going right to the point, which is your question was super timely here. In emerging fields, most of the innovations tend to be done by small companies, and we're certainly seeing that here. And big companies tend to get involved at later stages in the development process, if at all. So when we're talking about, and this is true not just in the psychedelic space, but I'd say there's been a big shift in general with pharmaceuticals. The old model, maybe 20 years ago, is that the big pharma companies, your Pfizers, your Bristol Myers, your Eli Lillys, would do everything from the idea stage and the early, pre-clinical R&D all the way through the process. And there's really been a model change with pharmaceutical companies now, where the big pharmaceutical companies, many of them don't even have a research and development division anymore. What they do is let other groups, other small companies and university professors and others sort of come up with the ideas and do the early work. And then they buy these things up after they've sort of proven themselves out to a certain degree. And that timeline keeps getting later and later. What I'm generally seeing now is until drugs are already in the FDA approval process and have made it through at least phase 1 or phase 2 of the FDA process, they're generally not getting picked up by the big drug companies. So they have to go really far along the development process before the big investors come in. And generally, the big drug companies are the last big stage of investment that's needed to take these drugs all the way through the FDA process, because the phase 3 FDA trials, which are typically the last phase, are by far the most expensive. And so, these small companies, to get to that point where someone else will come in and help out, now need many millions of dollars to get to that level. At the low end, it might be 5 to 10 million, and that would be at the extreme low end. At the higher end, it might require several $100 million to get to that stage. And generally speaking, any money they're able to raise is really needed to be dedicated to research and development and these regulatory processes. They rarely have free funds available to defend against lawsuits. And so you can see a natural problem right there. I mentioned that these lawsuits cost millions of dollars. So, and the patents are powerful. So if someone has one of these bad patents sitting out there, and all of this development is generally happening in the hands of smaller companies, the party with the bad patent is in a position to potentially leverage that against these companies and potentially even extort them, because these companies don't have the funds to fight it. And there's a term for this that shows up in sort of other technological fields called patent trolling. It's this idea of sort of a troll sitting under the bridge, waiting for someone to cross and then jumping out and attacking them. And the idea of patent trolls are, you have either a questionable or a bad patent. You look for someone in a vulnerable position, and then you attack them. And here the attack would be either a threat, perhaps when the company's out trying to raise money, or actually a lawsuit. And the patent troll doesn't intend to go all the way through a lawsuit, because they don't want to spend that money either, but they know they have a leverage position. And so the game here is, they file the lawsuit and they ask the party who they've threatened to pay them some amount of money. And it's oftentimes something much less than the cost of the lawsuit, because the party who's getting threatened might believe they could win the lawsuit. So if the troll asks for too much money, the other party, if they could come up with the money at all, and oftentimes they cannot, but if they could, they just fight it. But what the patent troll does is they ask for, say, $500,000, something much less than the cost of the lawsuit. And the little company might have to pay them that money, because they might not be able to raise funds until that sort of threat or that lawsuit is resolved. And so we've got this situation where there's this potentially expensive tax put on the system. And given the wrong timing and the wrong set of conditions, it might actually drive the small companies out of business and slow or ultimately prevent the development of some of these valuable technologies from getting out there into the world. And I'll note too, it's not just sort of the cost of developing drugs. There's other costs that are required to get these sort of new classes of drugs out there in the world, and that's infrastructure costs. There'll have to be new types of manufacturing facilities put into place for these drugs, specialized clinics for treating patients. This is not something you might go to your normal doctor and just get a pill or an injection. I mean, maybe in the future, but when you think about things like psilocybin treatment for people with, say, treatment-resistant depression, that's oftentimes sitting in a room with someone and going through a multi-hour session. And the average doctor's office is not set up to do that. So there's infrastructure investments that are needed here as well to sort of get these new types of treatments out there in the world. And all of that's potentially at threat by patent trolls or bad patent players who have patents that cover these things. Maybe not just the drugs, but we've seen people attempt to patent the set and setting. For example, comfortable furniture and dark rooms and calm music in the context of therapy regimes for psychedelics. People are trying to patent sort of all aspects of this area. And so bad patents risk development across the full spectrum. Let me stop there and see if there's any thoughts or questions.
So I'm assuming that when the patent trolls are doing the trolling, there's probably some line at which it becomes legally frivolous. like it could be determined as frivolous. Um, does that ever come into play, or is it like that would cost money for the smaller companies to prove as well? Does that prevent them from trying to claim that the lawsuits or that it's frivolous?
Yeah, it's a great question, and especially a good sub question, because it's got two layers to the answer. So if it's an entirely frivolous case, let's say I have a patent on a new way to tie your shoe, and I sued you under that for running a psychedelic therapeutics company. That would be truly frivolous, and that my patent doesn't even have anything to do with your field. That's the type of case you could probably get rid of fairly inexpensively. Although, to your sub question, there is still some cost there. You're going to have to file a motion with the court. You can probably ask to get your attorney's fees back for that, and you probably win on that. So generally speaking, you don't see the trolling oftentimes done that poorly. But yeah, there still would be some costs. And if someone, I hate to say this, but if the patent troll asks you for $500 to make the problem go away, it's probably worth giving them the $500 rather than spending the 20 or 30,000 it might take to get the court to dismiss it, and the motion you'll have to file to try to get your attorney's fees back, which you're not guaranteed to win. I might be tempted to spend the money, fortunately I'm a patent attorney, so I could just do my own work there, for the principle of it. But trolls are good at pricing things correctly. But the bigger problem is if they've been granted a patent, and so the patent office made a mistake for kind of the reasons we talked about, there's a presumption of validity in that patent, even though it might be invalid. Legally, it has a presumption of validity because the patent office, a U.S. government agency with expertise in evaluating the legality of these things, granted it. And so it's hard to argue it's truly frivolous if the government blessed the patent right, unless you can show that the patent owner absolutely knew that their patent was bad. You've got a much more expensive route. And there, the patent control can get those higher dollars out of that extortion game.
We have another question. Karen is asking, please, can you provide some additional examples of problematic patents that have been approved?
Oh, so that it's almost like I've got little elves out there helping me. That's actually the next topic. So the timing on that is perfect. Thank you for that question. And I actually had some questions here. I'm skipping a slide because we already talked about this one. I'm going to give you two examples that have gotten a bit of press. And Porta Sophia is involved in dealing with both of these, and I'll come back to that in future slides here. But one of them is a U.S. patent 11235110 that has been referenced as the DMT vape device or vape pen patent. It's a patent where the inventor is actually a patent attorney. It's not a company. It's not a group that did any traditional R&D research. It's an inventor who recognized that there was an opportunity in the patent office to potentially get a patent, and they filed a patent application on an idea that is not new that the patent office granted. And the patent claim, this particular patent that was granted, covers the following: putting DMT or 5-MeO-DMT or one other psychedelic drug, 2CB, putting any one of those three into a vape device in a vaporizable formulation. That's the patent. So anyone who puts DMT in a vaporizable formulation in a vape device, in theory, infringes that patent. And there's nothing special about the concept of the vaporizable formulation. What's described in the patent are all of the known ingredients you would use for vaping anything else. It's the same exact chemistry that has been used for nicotine and cannabis and any of the other things that have been vaped year after year after year going back in time. If you read the patent, there's no innovation in it whatsoever, but the patent office granted it. This was filed in the year 2020. And it doesn't take too much work to find out that people have been posting online forums for many, many years before this, their experiences with vaping DMT, their formulations, and exactly how to do it. So this clearly wasn't new, but it wasn't in earlier patents, and it wasn't in peer-reviewed publications, or not, at least in a way that it was easy for the patent office to find them. So this one got granted. One more example. And this is a European patent that was just recently deemed grantable. It's European patent 3927337. And this is what we call a use patent. And again, this is another recently filed patent application. It was filed in the year 2020. So this is not an old innovation or alleged innovation. It covers the idea of using 5-MeO-DMT, which is one of the sort of short list of highly sought after clinical targets now for moving psychedelics into the clinical space, for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression or major depressive disorders. And there's sort of two gimmicks they use to get this patent. One is kind of terminology-based. They specifically referred to two subcategories of depression, referring to treatment-resistant depression and major depressive disorder. And those terms, in a sense, are fairly new. So if you go back to the early days of 5-MeO-DMT, which you can, and people's use of it for treating depression, you'll find that goes back to at least the 1980s. People weren't describing it in the context of treatment-resistant depression or major depressive disorder. They were using different terminology because a lot of this terminology changes over time. So one gimmick here was defining the disease conditions or the conditions as using modern terminology. But the second one, and I think it's the bigger of the gimmicks, is the way they worded their patent claim was a requirement that the patient be diagnosed by a professional clinician capable of diagnosing them as having one of those two conditions. And what that theoretically did is it removed some of the prior art that was out there, the prior work out there where people were sort of self-medicating with these compounds, or where, because these weren't in peer-reviewed publications necessarily, or in earlier patents, it turns out it is in peer-reviewed publications. The patent office just didn't do a good job finding it. There wasn't necessarily a link to a specific patient who had specifically been diagnosed by the right type of professional. So it was difficult to find the prior art. And I'll come back to this later on with a future slide here, but it turns out trained clinicians have been diagnosing people with these two conditions for over 20 years and treating them with 5-MeO-DMT. So this is also not new. Yet both of these patents were granted, one in the United States and one in Europe. That was a lot. And
we have more.
Stirred up some feelings. So any thoughts or questions on those?
We have lots more questions. So let's see. It looks like James has had his hand up if you would just like to ask directly. And then I have a couple from the chat.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm interested in the legality and the scope of patents involving psychoactive substances like psilocybin, but incorporating them into food products like chocolate. So if you have two different products that use the same psychoactive substance but differ in food formulation, like chocolate, cocoa, is it warrant two separate patents, or can you explain that for me, please?
Yeah. So in theory, you can get a patent on putting a natural compound like psilocybin into a food product, so long as it meets the qualifications for patenting. The two probably most challenging ones there are it has to be new, meaning no one's done it before, and it has to be non-obvious, which means even if no one's done it before, it's not sort of one of those things that someone would look at, someone sort of skilled in the field, in the technical field, would look at and say, well, of course you would do that based on what came before. Mm-hmm. But if you do have something sort of new and non-obvious, you can get a patent on a thing. So in theory, the first person who ever had the idea and maybe did some research around putting psilocybin in a food product might have been able to get a patent on, broadly on psilocybin in any food products and own that generally. Now, obviously, that's not something you could do just based on the history of how psilocybin has been used. Psilocybin is found naturally in a food product and has been found that way for many, probably millennia. But there's a really interesting twist with patents. I'm going to throw out two scientific terms here, but I'll explain the context. Genus and species. So people might have learned about these terms from how sort of organisms are organized, right? Like humans are the genus Homo, species sapien, right? We're Homo sapien. So genus refers to the broader category, species refers to subgroups under that. You can have a situation where someone sort of develops a genus, like put this drug into food products, and the genus there being sort of food generally. And if they're the first to do that and it's not obvious, they might be able to get a patent on that. That does not prevent them or someone else from later on getting a more specific patent on an innovation that's still a food product, but that involves some inventive work. So let's say I find out, using your example, that I can get psilocybin into chocolate, and that if I throw some vitamin E in there and something else, it gives like a better effect. The effects, maybe the trip is shorter and more effective, which is really interesting, right? Like psilocybin takes a long time, so if you can get a better benefit with a shorter trip, that would be lovely. And that seems like a really true innovation. It's still a food product with psilocybin in it, but it would almost certainly be patentable there because you sort of came up with a new recipe that enhanced the performance of it. And so you might be able to get someone else might have the patent on food plus psilocybin in it, and you get the patent on chocolate and vitamin E and whatever the other ingredient is with psilocybin in it. And both of you can have your patents.
Interesting, because I'm curious. I'm out in Arizona. The Arizona legislation just appropriated $5 million for whole mushroom work, and I'm curious about potential entourage effects and the many unknowns of the whole mushroom versus just the compound of psilocybin. So thank you.
I know a lot of people are exploring that, and there's been quite a bit of patenting around that. We're definitely seeing people patenting sort of extracts from the natural products themselves, and either adding something extra to them, or going from mushroom to tea and then patenting it in tea form, things like that.
Very interesting. Thank you.
We have another question from Olga. You gave two examples here of a US patent and a European patent. She's asking who grants patents of psychedelic related patents in Canada? And that may just be, any patents in Canada, or do you know?
Yeah, so almost every country in the world, it's not quite all of them, but it's more than 200 of them, have their own patent offices that review these patent applications and determine whether patents should be granted. So getting a patent in one country does not guarantee you a patent in another country. And Canada has its own very sophisticated independent patent office that reviews these patent applications. But it also can make mistakes. And just going to the specific examples we have here, Canada also granted a patent on the DMT vape device idea. So there's both a US and a Canadian patent on that idea. I would say they were a little bit better than the US Patent Office in their review, but they still granted something that, in my opinion, should not have been granted.
There's an additional question from Lucia, and you've already started to answer it, but I'll just ask it in case there's anything to elaborate on. Those granted patents are limited to a specific jurisdiction. Confused about how that works. So I guess you've started to answer it, but do they look for prior arts from other jurisdictions, or how would you like to answer that?
Yeah, there's, I think, two aspects to that. So patents, in terms of their power, exist country by country. So if I have a patent in the United States, it allows me to block others from making, using, selling, and importing things into the United States. But if I only had the patent in the United States, it would not impact Canada or Japan or China or Europe, any of the European countries, unless someone was doing part of the work in the United States. So if they manufactured in the United States and exported it to Canada, I could stop that. But if I had the patent just in the United States, someone would be free in Canada to make it and use it and sell it and import it just in Canada, so long as the commerce chain did not hit the United States. So each country operates largely independently of each other. There are some exceptions. Europe in particular has a unified patent system now, where you can get a sort of a European patent that is enforceable among many of the countries. Not every country is a member of that, but we're seeing some trend lines along that where multiple countries might sort of share a patent system. But generally speaking, it's sort of country by country. And Then the question of prior art. So it hasn't always been this way, but basically the rule now in almost every country that has a patent system is if there's prior work in any country, it blocks the patenting of an idea in any other country. So to block a patent in the United States, we don't have to find the prior art in the United States. It could be found anywhere in the world, and that would be sufficient to stop the patent in the United States.
Thank you. And Olga has her hand up now, so go right ahead.
Yeah, so I think in alignment with that, David, I'm just kind of curious around, they look at the literature. And so I'm coming in from, my particular positioning within arts and humanities, not from a science, although I have that background. And so I'm just wondering, and maybe that's the question more to the Canadian Patent Office, because there's probably lots of myths, like unless we look into the, as you well know, into the Indigenous past, then it's not showing up. So, the looking glass is very narrow and is more, and this is, I'm getting very activated, is more as a, let's look so that it's better for us. And it sounds like through some of these examples, like either they're just not, who cares, and just moving it forward, or there is such a strategic placement of some of these patents that almost scares me a little bit. And the part of it that scares me a bit is in relationship to stopping people from doing these particular activities, criminalizing, having, as you've used the word many times, having a regime that, again, through these particular legal ownerships, stops people from engaging in the activities that they have always done and forever, hopefully now won't be able to do. Anyways.
No, you're right. And you raise a good point that it's worth highlighting an additional detail here. Generally speaking, when the patent reviewers are looking in the peer-reviewed literature, they're looking at the scientific peer-reviewed literature, where in this case, some of the information is actually found in the humanities literature. So they might be looking at sort of Medline or PubMed databases, and what they're not going to find there is discussions of indigenous practices with a number of these techniques and approaches that have been around for a long time. So it may in fact be in peer-reviewed literature, but it's not the peer-reviewed literature that's being looked at. One note I'll make, though, this is actually kind of a little heartwarming tidbit. And I've given some talks on this in other places. So if you search around, if you want more details on this, I think there's some public information out there with me speaking on this. But indigenous groups in the United States, at least those that are recognized as sovereign nations, and many of them are immune from patent lawsuits in the United States. So they can, to the extent they are continuing with indigenous practices or just want to do something new, they cannot be sued for patent infringement. And that's based on their sovereign immunity as being their own sovereign nation. So a little benefit there, to the great detriment of a lot of their practices being sort of extracted and in some cases patented.
Do you think that's the same in Canada? I'm just wondering, I mean, there is under the Religious Freedom Act in relationship acknowledging certain groups as religious, but what I'm hearing you say that it's more related to the relationship as a sovereign nation to nation. So it's more on that federal level rather than the sort of allowance of religious freedom.
Yeah, and so I don't know the answer in Canada, and it'd be a question that would be really interesting to explore. In the United States, it is at the federal level, but that's all that's needed because patent law is federal law only. So if you get immunity at the federal level, you've got complete immunity in the United States. But it'd be a really interesting question to see where Canada stands on this. I know other countries like Brazil are currently looking at policy to protect and expand indigenous rights and practices around psychedelics. And more generally, to prevent patenting from interfering. And there's actually some significant emerging international efforts to try to get international buy-in to some of these, but I would say they're early stage, and they'll be facing potentially the giant wall of commerce and lobbying and other things pushing back on it. So I'm optimistic that there might be something done there, but also pessimistic about how strong any new rules will be applied.
Olga, you still have your hand up. Did you
Yeah,
want to?
maybe Karen has a question because
Yeah.
hers came in before my second hand up. Do you want me to read it? So Karen asks, earlier you discussed the usefulness of good patents, which help organizations develop innovation. I think you were speaking to that. But do you see a path for the wise use of patents in the psychedelic field? Right? Like, can we leverage the use of patents to be able to potentially resist, or I don't know if that's what you mean, Karen, but to kind of counterattack in some way, like maybe the indigenous folks could potentially do?
Yeah, I think there are some efforts that could be done. So there is a concept called defensive patenting. And this is basically where an entity files patent applications on their ideas, and they may not actually ever be granted. They might be, they might not be. But the act of filing them makes it easy for the patent office to see all of that information and to prevent anyone else from patenting those same concepts afterwards. And if a patent is granted, it could be, the owner of it can do whatever they want with it, including donating it to the public domain. So they can make those basically public rights at that point. And you do see some small efforts to do that in a number of fields. And at least some of the discussions I've had with some of the people pursuing some of the patents, they say they're doing it for that purpose. We shall see.
And then can I ask a follow-up kind of a question? Is that okay? Thanks, Ashley. I think my other question is, I've heard in other sort of legal circles, not that I'm in legal circles, but sort of this notion that and this is happening in some of the indigenous communities where there's this sort of legal process where there's personhood or sort of identity allocated to, let's say, a river or a plant so that it becomes a person. So if a plant becomes a person legally, would it then that stop it being patented or used?
Yeah, technically, yes, in the United States. There is a ban on patenting humans in the United States. But I don't think I would expect that level of recognition of personhood in non-humans that would ever implicate the US patent rules on that. And the reason I say that is that's sort of been explored when it came to innovations around genetic engineering of animals. And the decision there was the ban is humans and humans only. So, highly conscious animals are patentable so long as they're not human. If you genetically modify a dog or a cat or a dolphin or an octopus, you can get a patent on that. And you can actually own a genetically engineered version of a very sophisticated living organism. And so it'd be hard for me to imagine that level of recognition of an individual rights that would rise to the level that would block the patenting.
I thought only corporations could have personhood in the United States.
Yeah, isn't that one funny, right? Like something that's purely theoretical, sort of in another legal regime moved into that space. I will say though that under the patent law, corporations are not treated as humans.
That makes sense. I did want to just go back to Karen's question a little bit. I think it was a little general. She's saying earlier you discussed the usefulness of good patents, which help organizations develop innovation. So I know from my conversations that you remain encouraged by the way things are going and see a potential future. So she's asking, do you see a path for the wise use of patents in the psychedelic field? Like, how does it serve not just to block the bad players, but move us forward?
Yeah, and I am actually fairly optimistic that we've got a nice, much cleaner future here. And we'll talk next about some of the things Porta Sophia has been doing to ensure that that's the case. But good patents actually do, we talked about how important they are in the pharmaceutical space in terms of leveraging that limited window of exclusivity to get the funding needed to make it through the process. So where there are true innovations, I think patents serve a valuable role in this field. And there are problems to be solved, right? So, psychedelics relative to other drug categories, I think, have a very safe profile, but they're not perfectly safe. And some of them are safer than others. And there's going to be costs associated with the use of these that might be prohibitive in terms of getting them out there in the world in really wide use for all the people who need them, because of the amount of time and effort needed to do the therapies in a sort of safe and ethical way. And I think innovations can help solve those problems. We can have more effective, shorter acting compounds, safer compounds, and the natural compounds are quite good, but I'm imagining there will be versions of these compounds that are better yet. And I can envision, say, 10 years from now, that most of the drugs out there that are actually used in the clinic might actually be synthetic versions of natural compounds, or purely synthetic versions that would then be something that's rightfully patented because it will have involved tremendous problem solving and innovation, and good on that party who made things safer and better and more cost effective and gets these drugs out there so they can be used for more things and more widely used. That's the patent system working well.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have for right now. If you wanted to continue, and then
all right. Let me talk about what Porta Sophia is doing. So we're really about sort of open science, open access, innovation through information sharing. We want people not to have any of these bad patents, and even the specter of these bad patents not to interfere with what appears to be a very, very important new emerging field for healthcare. And so we've set up our organization to address the problems I've identified here in a number of different ways. And one of the first ways we do that is to find all of the bad patents. And our team systematically goes through, and we don't catch absolutely every one of them, but we're now looking at 33 psychedelic compounds, which are listed on the bottom of the slide here. And we find every patent and patent application that relates to any one of these, and we evaluate it. And by evaluating it, we look at it for a number of things. We put it into what we call a 3-tier evaluation system for sort of high risk, mild risk, or no risk. And to do that, we look at how broad are the patent claims. Is this something that's going to reach through in an attempt to cover things that are in the prior art? Is there data in it? Is this just someone had an idea sitting on their sofa and filed it with the patent office to see if they could get a patent? Or was this something where people did really innovative work and did some real science and discovered something real? And then we evaluate it based on a threat to innovation. We have a pretty good feel for what's out there in the world in terms of the pathways people are taking to get these things out into the healthcare space. And we, ask ourselves, this might be a bad patent, but if it's a bad trivial patent, it's going to get a lower priority ranking than a really threatening to innovation bad patent. And we try to monitor sort of bad players, find the patent trolls, the people who are filing multiple of these things, and then evaluate theirs more carefully. And then we specifically have an indigenous awareness effort here to try to protect traditional practices from coming under the realm of patenting. And so as part of that evaluation, we look everywhere in the world, unlike the patent office. And some of the patent examiners look broadly, but as I mentioned, they tend to look in narrow categories. We look everywhere. And that includes peer-reviewed literature, and that includes older patents, but it also includes online forums, which, a lot of the evidence is out there. It's going through ancient documents. In the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, I have a 1916 Park Davis catalog. Park Davis was a drug company that eventually got bought by Pfizer. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, it was really active in the psychedelic medicine space. And then, they just got out of that. So we've got this sort of 20, 30-year window in the turn of that century where there's a lot of prior art. That's not going to show up in any normal databases. We go to archives. A lot of groups have archived, a lot of this work that happened in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, but it's not an easy to find electronic searchable databases. And so we gather all that information. We find the stuff where it is. And one thing that's important here is we base our searches on the actual patent applications that we're seeing people applying for. So we find the hundreds and hundreds of patent applications that people are seeking patents for. We find the bad patents among them. And then we actually go out and find the prior art specifically for those patent applications. So we're not just filling in a random library here. We're filling our library with the very information the patent offices around the world need to stop the actual bad patents that are in the process. And then what we do is we fill our online, free, easy to search, powerful library with that information. And this is all done with human curated care. So to date, we have over 2,000 prior art references in our library, and you can see it's growing at a fairly linear rate. And just to give you a view of what that looks like, we have a nice, easy to use search engine. You put in your keyword, you can put date delimited topics on that. You can pick the type of document you want to look for. You can't see all the search items on here, but you can search by drug, by disease type. And then what you'll get are specific hits of everything that's in the library with all of our curated information and all of your keywords highlighted. And we'll have our own abstract we wrote about that individual prior art reference, putting it in the context of why it's valuable to the patents we know are already sitting out there. So any patent examiners using this tool, instead of having to spend hours trying to look for something, which they generally don't have time to do, in seconds, they can get to exactly the type of information they need presented in exactly the way they need to see it. But this is also a really useful tool for anyone who thinks they've innovated something to figure out whether what they have is actually new or not, and whether they should bother to file a patent application or not. This tool just didn't exist, and now it does. And so we've Porta Sophia is a combination of Greek and Latin terms that stand for doorway to wisdom. And part of that idea is we're basically creating a doorway to the wisdom of the world by putting all of the relevant information in one easy to find spot here. Let me stop there and see if there's any questions about sort of our library work before I talk about some of the more proactive stuff we do against some of these bad patent applications.
If there aren't any on the stream, we're good to continue.
Okay. So the other big thing we do is we directly challenge the bad patent applications. And this can be done with what's called a third-party intervention. So what happens when someone files a patent application is 18 months after it's filed, it publishes, and the world can see it. And generally speaking, it typically takes 2, 3, or 4 years to actually get a patent granted after it's filed. So in almost every case, it's publishing before it's granted. So we're able to see it. And then we can see what patent reviewer it's assigned to. And we can directly give them information saying, here's the stuff you want to look at when you review this. So they don't even have to do the searches. We find the relevant stuff and we just hand it to them. And so far, we've filed over 100 of these third-party interventions. There are quite a bit of work to do because you actually had to file a fairly formal document with the patent office. And a lot of these are still early stage, but we've been really successful with these so far. Of the 100 plus we've filed, 11 of the patent applications have actually been abandoned. The patent owner just gave up. On 14 of them, there was a rejection from the patent office where the applicants didn't abandon it based on the information we gave them. Keeping in mind, most of the 100 of these haven't even gotten reviewed yet. So we're expecting this number to go way up from where it is right now. And then in 2 of them, the applicants saw what we did and made their claims much, much more narrow to the point where they were no longer high-risk patents. So they went from sort of being a bad citizen to a good citizen. And when I say that, they may not have known that their claims were bad originally. Hopefully people are doing the homework. We'll give them sort of the benefit of the doubt, but they went from bad claims to good claims after seeing this. Like I said, it's early on. What I can say is not one of these 100 plus patent applications that we've challenged has been granted with the broad claims that it started with. There have been a few granted, but with much, much narrower claims. So this seems to be a mechanism that's blocking these high threat patent applications. And we're really excited about how productive this process has been. Any questions on that?
No.
All right. a few more things we're doing. We do a lot of education, research, outreach and awareness. And just to give you some examples, the more people who know about what we're doing, the better we can do what we do, because as you'll see, a lot of people who learn what we do join us and help us through a volunteer network. We have a lot of connections with media organizations. We actually have a lot of connections now with the companies that are filing these bad patent applications, and that's helping them sort of be better world citizens. But just a few examples of where we are out there in the world. We've been taking advantage where possible of media coverage and helping people get smarter. What I've identified here is the Vice organization, when they were still around, did a documentary. This is available on YouTube as a freebie. I think this is somewhere between 1 and 2 million views now, where I participated in this and had a fairly major section talking about the work we're doing, and specifically talking about a controversial patent application that was filed by Compass Pathways that related to their attempt to patent set and setting related to psilocybin treatments for depression. We have a really active social media presence with a lot of good regular information going out there. Whenever we find some of these really bad patent applications, we'll put out press on it, which allows others who might be interested about it to contact us, and we can work together with them to potentially find this prior art more easily and to get the word out there. We've also been very active in publishing our own work, and we're going to have a lot more on this front. Some very exciting stuff going forward, but here's an example of a paper we published in February, kind of identifying some of the problems. And then a really exciting publication we just put out, and this relates to one of the two examples I talked about earlier. You'll recall I mentioned the European patent granted on the use of 5-MeO-DMT for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression or major depressive disorder. As we searched for prior art in this space, we identified some clinical work that had been done since the 1990s where patients were actually treated. These specific categories of patients were treated with this drug, but that information had not been made public. And so what we did is we collaborated with the clinician who did this work. And then this just came out this last month. We just published this paper on the very topic of this patent. And so this is out there if you want to read it. I think it's a very interesting paper. And I've just highlighted a little bit of language here. One of our sections is called Hidden in Plain Sight, 25 plus years of public knowledge on the use of this for psychiatric indications. And we go through and talk about how several thousand patients were treated. 20 to 30% of them actually had MDD or TRD and were diagnosed as such. And then we have some specific case studies in this paper describing specific patients with each of those conditions getting treated and receiving benefits from the drug. And the value of this paper is, what I'm showing here is an opposition document. In Europe, you can oppose patents once they're granted, and the patent office takes another look at them. There are two opposition opposers to this patent that was deemed grantable. Porta Sophia is one of them. The other one's a group called Strawman Limited. It's actually a group that will do challenges anonymously for someone working behind the scenes. And I've highlighted in the lower right here the paper we just recently published being submitted as one of the bits of evidence to show that this patent should not have been granted. So we're sort of outing this information that was not outed in very public ways and putting it into use to challenge these bad patents. Another, I think, really important aspect of our work is we've created this thing called the Archival Research Network, and it's a group of volunteers all around the world who decide they're interested enough in the work we're doing that they join us. And we have a process for sort of applying to the organization just so we can sort of vet people to make sure they're sort of on our side and not trying to sabotage us in some way. But this is a network of now dozens of people, experts around the world, people who manage archives. And when our team cannot find prior art, what we do is we email this group of sort of world experts, and they find it for us. And we've got people all around the world who can speak different languages, so we're able to find documents in native German or native Mandarin that would be harder to find because our team can't normally read them. And this group's been super effective at finding the hard to find prior art and really enhancing our library and just giving us a bigger team of sort of volunteer network that we can reach out to for help when we run into problems. We're also very active in hosting and co-sponsoring webinars and conferences. We just had one recently in Madison, Wisconsin here, along with the USONA Institute, called Bridging Worlds Immersive Forum, and it brought together a lot of indigenous groups to just talk about all the issues going on related to drug development in this space, and concerns about, taking indigenous ideas and indigenous what are considered sacred practices. And as part of this, Porta Sophia talked about intellectual property issues around this. And I learned a lot from a lot of the indigenous groups that were there. We had breakout lunches and had casual conversations, and it was super useful. And then we've got a lot more in progress. I can't go into details yet on it, but we are going to start challenging issued patents. It's really expensive to do that, but we've been able to fundraise around that. And one of the patents we will be challenging is the notorious vape pen patent. So look for more about that in the near future. We'll have some press about that. And with that, I'm done with my slides. So let me stop sharing, and we can open it up for Q&A.
James?
Hello, thank you very much. I'm interested in, as psychedelics become more mainstream, I suspect more religion organizations to emerge. And with that, I'm very fearful of New Age religions trying to copy indigenous practices, but make it their own. And so I'm curious if you could speak to particularly how psychoactive substances that are embedded in religion practices, could that model or methodology be patented? And if so, what's stopping from somebody from taking a particular drug, whether it be DMT or 5-MeO, attaching it to their new religion and then trying to get it within, I guess, a modeled state? Does that make sense?
It does. So, the kind of the bad news and maybe the shocking news here for a number of you is it is the type of thing that can be patented. Okay. Now, in theory, if it's copying indigenous practices, it should not validly be patented. But again, the patent office isn't going to be able to search for these things. We are keeping our eyes out for these things, and we will be challenging patents like that if we see patent applications like that if we see them, and reaching out to our networks to if it's copying indigenous practices, we're going to reach out for help. And what we've definitely learned in having those conversations is one of the questions we need to ask right away is, do you want the help? But yeah, that's something we will make ourselves available if help is wanted to help in that space. But yeah, if someone does actually come up with some innovative practices, it is the type of thing they can patent. And I agree with you. I think, if you look at some of the history about a number of the existing religions that are out there, including some of the big ones that might not have this history well publicized, a lot of them, there is some evidence they seem to have some psychedelic experiences in their founding. And so I think there's good reasons to think we will see a lot of new religion and religion-like practices come out of the use of these compounds.
And for the record, I just want to be clear that I'm all for self-religious practices. And if somebody has a spiritual belief, they're entitled to do that. But I'm just more concerned about the safety and efficacy of these medicines and making sure that people are practicing within their role of expertise.
Yeah. And, like everything in the world, a lot of people like to step out of their roles of expertise.
Thank you for this.
I don't necessarily have a question, but this is just getting a lot of gears turning, and I think I'm simultaneously more frustrated and angry with what's going on, but also overall feeling more optimistic with what you all are doing at Porta Sophia. But the thing that's really irking me right now is in the case of the DMT vape, 5-MeO DMT vape, is like, okay, so there are these kind of like what I would view as like trailblazers. There are people who already kind of like figured out these processes and devices and did all the legwork there, also with fear of legal repercussions and operating under that pressure. And now it's like theoretically, if the patent goes through, they would still be doing something illegal if they vaporize the DMT, but for a completely different reason, for the reason of, a company coming along and saying like, well, this is safe and, it can be done effectively, but we came up with the idea. That's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
really
It's got
bothering
a
me.
lot of yucky angles around it. And so that patent has been granted. That one's out there in the world and could, in theory, be enforced, right? So, and two comments on that. So one is, vaping is one of the very limited routes by which that drug will be taken. And when you consider potentially individual home use of it, that's probably the most viable way for it to be taken. And the question of will that be out there in the world as an approved, safe, and efficacious version? We'll know that soon, because I believe there are clinical trials right now in either phase 2 or phase 3 for vaped 5-MeO DMT, right? So we're going to get the answer to that quite soon, and that might be sort of out there in the world, and then that patent is sitting there. So that's one of the reasons we're targeting this one in particular. Is it's an issued patent, and it does, in the hands of an owner who's a patent attorney, um, it does seem to present a risk that is going to only cause trouble. And if we can clear the path, we're going to clear the path on it. And I'm pretty sure we're going to be able to clear the path on this one. We'll see.
Well, yeah, I'll be rooting for you for sure. For you all.
We have another question from Karen. From a policy perspective, are patents the wise direction to protect Indigenous knowledge and practice, or is there a different route that's more appropriate?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm going to highlight the word protect there, because like historically, it hasn't been sort of legally protected. There aren't, to my knowledge, a lot of legal regimes to protect it. Now, obviously, there is efforts out there to create those regimes, but at the end of the day, those have to be implemented sort of country by country or potentially state by state, and or by treaty. And those are slow processes that are political and rarely give the full value that one would want. So to the extent someone if patents are good for protecting new innovations, they cannot protect old innovations. So if there are indigenous groups that develop something new, they may want to consider patenting it as a way to prevent it from being abused outside of their circles. And patenting would certainly be one way to do that. And at Porta Sophia, we volunteer our time to do that for free for indigenous organizations who want to do that. But there's a huge cost component to patenting. We're willing to sort of make that cost go away if someone wants to file a patent to protect others from getting into their space. Because a lot of these practices are so old, though, patenting is really not a viable option for existing practices. So having one of these sort of government recognized rights to traditional practices is maybe the strongest way to go to prevent interference by outsiders. And that will require a lot of political action. And if people are interested, you can find those groups. They're actually quite active now in trying to get that off the ground.
I just have a clarifying question. Didn't you say that this kind of falls into the category of defensive patents? So even though an organization or a group or an individual is not granted the patent, it then puts it on the record for existing. So that's
that
only doesn't give protection.
That could be done. You could file a document with the government that describes all of the things you want to make sure are very clear or out there, so that no one can pretend that they invented them now. Absolutely. And that doesn't have to be through a patent. It could also be defensive publishing, putting things anywhere out in the world where they're easy to find. Although there's nothing easier to find for patent reviewers than patents. So going the patent route is a particularly good way to do it.
Thank you. Arshia, do we have any questions from the feed?
No, we don't have any questions on the stream.
On the stream, sorry. Thank you. Technology.
Well, I might throw a question out there if you're open, David.
Absolutely.
I guess just in a general sense, you know, you kind of seeing it come out here in the question or in all the questions everyone has. There's like a, you know, I think a really good passionate kind of activism streak in the psychedelic scene for a variety of reasons, which is wonderful. I think is why so many people feel drawn to here. For those of us who aren't in the legal world, I know you touched on this a little bit with the various things you guys are doing, but right now, like if someone wanted to help right now, could you speak on that, people who aren't in the legal world? And then maybe as kind of a subsection of that, because there's a lot of academics in this group and watching this, is there anything we could do particularly to help? I know you mentioned that that archival project, so maybe you could speak a little bit more on that.
Yeah, so I'd say there's I'll describe it at 3 layers. So in the simplest layer, just learning about it, getting smart about it, and talking about it to anyone who's willing to listen helps. The more people who sort of know about these issues, the better. So the fact that you're hosting something like this really helps because it gets people who care to know about it. And then when problems arise, they're sort of much closer to knowing who to contact to help deal with those problems. So that's one of the biggest things that someone can do. But more directly, I would say 2 things. If people are interested in volunteering for the Archival Research Network, you know, head to our website, fill out the form. And you know, what we're looking for here are people with sort of expertise in the area of information gathering, but you don't need to be a super expert. And there's more information about that on the site. But separate from that, we are a nonprofit organization that is volunteer funded, and we're happy to take donations from anyone. So to the extent people have some spare dollars and want to donate to the cause, we have a very small professional staff and a lot of volunteers. So for example, I'm a private practice attorney. I am not an employee of Porta Sophia. I'm one of the founders of it, but I'm a advisor and consultant, and 100% of my time is free. So we have a number of attorneys who do the same. The costs are largely tied to paying some fees to do some of these patent office filings and to pay for our professional staff. And it's a very small group that does these 100 plus, you know, third-party submissions. They work really hard and they're really smart. And so we're really careful with our money. So it's a good, there's a huge bang for your buck, and every little bit helps. So I'll throw out the note there, and easy ways to donate on our website with easy buttons to click. We also have swag. So if you want like a Porta Sophia t-shirt or other things, we have some really cool designs. They're not very expensive. And the profits of that goes 100% into our efforts.
Great, thank you so much.
Except we can't get them before Christmas because Canada Post here in Canada is on strike.
Oh no.
There are always other holidays to gift Porta Sophia swag that are all appropriate. It looks like we're running out of questions. I really just am so grateful that you could join us today. I think from the scientific perspective and the humanities perspective, we often have a lot of questions about how all of this really comes to fruition, right? And it is such this niche area that is yours, right? We're like, well, how do we do this? We train people to deliver services if the medical model prevails, but then how does medicine available? And, you know, what really inspires me about your work is you continue to find solutions to create and maintain access to medicine, which is so valuable and important. So thank you so much.
Well, again, thank you for having me. The more people who learn about this, the stronger we all are as a team to make sure this is done as correctly as it can be.
Yeah, thank you so much again. I feel like this is only our second event, but now we're on a streak, so it's definitely set the bar high for everything moving forward. So this is super informative, and I'm glad that we all have an outlet we can potentially help through.
Excellent. Well, welcome to the Army.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how, and I'm hoping that there is that connection. Like last night, there was a panel discussing sort of decolonizing the psychedelic space and infusing it with some ethical awareness in relationship to appropriation ownership. So it's interesting how I'm hoping that folks will start to get connected, because so often, and as it is in many different domains, there's sort of these siloed advocacy activities going on, but I'm seeing that there's these movements that are percolating, and that will make a really nice sort of matrix, if you will, to create some of that transformative change.
Yeah, I have the same optimism, and I'm seeing the same connections made.
The mycelium network.
They really do want to eat this, don't they?
Well, unless there are any last questions, I guess we can wrap things up.
Very good. Well, I'm glad I learned about what you're doing, and I will keep watching your work as you move forward.
Thank you, David. And as we shall as well.
All right.
All
Thanks
right.
for having me, and then have a good day, all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much.
Another job well done. Congratulations.